All right. Good morning, everyone, or good day, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this NIP update webinar. So my name is Amara Pravat, and I am a Project Execution Officer at the BCRC Caribbean. And today we are hosting the webinar on the development and update of national implementation plans on NIPs under the Stockholm Convention via the sectoral approach. So I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar and thank you very much for joining. Please note that we do have interpretation. So if you would like to hear today's webinar in Spanish, soon you'll be able to go to the Spanish room. So I'm going to just turn on interpretation now. Okay, so interpretation has been switched on. So as a reminder, if you'd like to hear today's webinar in Spanish, you can click on the globe at the bottom of your screen and click the Spanish room. If you'd like to hear the webinar in English, you can also click on that globe and click the English room. So to get us started, we will have some welcome remarks, followed by a presentation on the overview of Article 7 of the Stockholm Convention. We'll then move on to a presentation on the transition from the development of NIPS via POPs categories to a sectoral approach. We'll then have a presentation that sets the scene for the Caribbean context and the development and update of NIPS via a sectoral approach. Okay, so with that, I would like to pass the floor to Ms. Tashia Jean-Baptiste, Project Coordinator from the CARICOM Secretariat. Tashia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Amara. Thank you, colleagues. Good morning, everyone. And those who join us from other regions. Let me just, in terms of protocol, acknowledge Mr. Suman Sharma, Program Officer for the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, Ms. Mahalia Pond, Project Management Officer, Chemicals and Health Branch of the United Nations Environment Program, Ms. Joel Batchesing, Director, BCRC Caribbean, Ms. Marisha Charles, Project Coordinator, BCRC Caribbean, as well as other staff of the BCRC Caribbean office, representatives of the CARICOM Secretariat, and I'm happy that we should be joined by one of our officers within the Agriculture and Agro-Industrial Development Unit. Distinguished colleagues, participants from our focal points from across the Caribbean region, for the conventions, good morning. Let me just say thank you very much to everyone for joining this webinar. I know we have many competing demands on us as the year has started swiftly, but the interest in this topic stresses the importance of these issues when you look at national and regional compliance and enforcement with the Stockholm Convention in particular for this webinar. Recognizing the importance, we're certainly very pleased to have the Basel Regional Convention Center working with us and supporting these activities where we look to build capacity in the areas of legislative frameworks, international guidelines, and training on new chemicals under the Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions. The CARICOM Secretariat serves as the hub for the capacity building related to multilateral environmental agreements in ACP countries. And part of the work that we do is to build the capacity to implement multilateral environmental agreements in the Caribbean. One of the specific objectives which relates to this webinar is the development of national frameworks, legislations, and mechanisms for the effective implementation of selected biodiversity and chemicals and waste conventions. So therefore, an important aspect of this work is, of course, promoting the enforcement of and compliance with the BRS conventions within Caribbean parties by way of influencing policies and legislative frameworks related to chemicals and waste management in our region. Key to this, of course, is the increasing awareness, improving knowledge sharing, understanding, and communicating the relevance of these issues, as well as outreach. So with this in mind, the CARICOM Secretariat takes pleasure to be partners in the delivery of this webinar with the BCRC, and of course the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention, as well as UN Environment Program. We at the CARICOM Secretariat, we will continue to seek ways to build stronger and synergistic partnerships with key regional and international organizations as we continue to support efforts in building capacity in the area of chemicals and waste management. Of course, this work could not be possible without the support and funding by the joint initiative of the European Commission, OACP Secretariat, and UNEP. So on behalf of the CARICOM Secretariat, let me just welcome everyone who's joining online. And of course, I certainly look forward, and I know you will look forward to the presentations and the enlightening discussions which will follow. So thank you, and I hand over back to Amara. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Tashia, for your remarks. We will now pass the floor to Mr. Suman Sharma, Program Officer at the Secretariat of the Basel, Stockholm, and Rotterdam Convention, for some welcoming remarks. Mr. Sharma, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amara. Distinguished participants of this webinar on the development, review, and update of National Implementation Plan under the Stockholm Convention. Ms. Joel Bacha Singh, the Director of BCRC Caribbean. Ms. Tessia Jean-Baptiste, Project Coordinator, CARICOM Secretariat. International experts including Mihaela Pon, UNEP Chemicals and Health Branch, and experts of the regional centers. Ladies and gentlemen, very good morning to you all and welcome you to this webinar. Let me begin by thanking the Regional Center for holding this important webinar and invite the Secretariat to join. As you all know, the development and updating of the National Implementation Plan is central to the implementation of the obligations under the Stockholm Convention. NIP lays out the details not only on the inventory status of POPs chemicals in the country, but also on the regulatory and institutional frameworks to deal with these chemicals, national priorities and action plans that are formulated and agreed upon. Due to the very technical nature of the scope of the convention, the parties have made arrangements for the technical assistance, which among other includes the establishment of regional centers, development of guidance on inventory and alternatives, etc. The convention has also made further provision on providing technical assistance to the parties on their request, facilitated by the Secretariat, and we organize regional training workshops from time to time. I hope this webinar will be able to trigger the NIP review and updating process for many parties, including for the latest POPs through the sectoral approach. The Secretariat stands ready to support parties by providing any information guidance that may be required down the line in your endeavor to review and update your NIPs. I wish you all the success of this webinar and thank you for your active participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sharma. Now I would like to pass the floor to Ms. Joel Batchesing, Director of the BCRC Caribbean, to close out the opening remarks session. Joel, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Amara. Just confirming that you're hearing me well.
Yes.
Colleagues, a pleasant good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. It is, I speak with the hat of the BCRC Caribbean as a consultant doing this work for the CARICOM Secretariat, and of course acknowledging Tashia and her team at the CARICOM and the trust that they've put in us to ensure that we do this particular activity for the ACP MES project. I have to thank the support that we've had for this webinar in particular, and thanks Mahila and Suman for their support to us, and to you, the colleagues. It goes without saying that this NIP update and keeping the obligations of the Stockholm Convention are of paramount importance for the Caribbean region. As parties to the Stockholm Convention, it is imperative that obligations are met, and this NIP update process is particularly important as it evolves and keeping you abreast of this. And of course, I'll switch back to wearing the hat as BCRC, SCRC, that it also aligns with our work plan as now a Stockholm Convention Regional Center. We would not have been here today without that support from everyone on this call, as well as, of course, the CARICOM Secretariat and the funders for the ACP MEs. But I also have to shout out to the BCRC team as we really pull together to ensure the success of this particular webinar. So I'll stop there, and I do hope you enjoy. Some of it is quite technical, and I think some of you may revel in it. So looking forward to some of the questions and feedback, and overall increasing the reporting in the Caribbean region and meeting the obligations under the Stockholm Convention. Thanks very much, Amara.
Thank you very much, Jewel. Okay, so now we will move on to our first presentation for today. So this presentation will be an overview of Article 7 of the Stockholm Convention, and I would like to welcome back Mr. Sharma from the Secretariat of the Basel, Stockholm, and Rotterdam's conventions to take us through. Mr. Sharma, the floor is yours. And just as a reminder to everyone, as we do have interpretation, we do ask you to just keep them in mind and speak slow, not too slowly, but just as you speak, do keep them in mind and try not to speak too quickly. And I think Mr. Suman, you'll just have to let us know when you're ready for the next slide.
Thank you very much, Amara. So my presentation is about the provision of developing and implementing national implementation plan under the Stockholm Convention. The next slide, please. As you know, the Stockholm Convention was adopted in 2001, and it entered into force only in 2004. And there are 186 parties to this convention. So you can see that in the picture here, you know, those colored blue are the parties. So it covers almost the whole world. Next slide, please. The NIP is, National Implementation Plan. The name itself suggests it is a plan. So this is the very first thing the parties, once they ratify the convention, once they become the party to the convention, the very first thing that they need to do is to prepare the National Implementation Plan and transmit it to the COP. So this is, the very first step to the entire life cycle. So, there is a plan, and that plan is implemented, and this implementation is reported through Articles 15 reporting. And then, there are technical and financial assistance available for parties, those who are eligible to receive. So, and then once, and once they implement the report, and then, the effectiveness of implementation is measured through a global approach, through the effectiveness evaluation process, which is also provision in Article 16. And the effectiveness evaluation process would provide more recommendations if whether or not the convention is meeting its objective, and then that is reflected again on the national implementation plan. It is a very good example of act locally and think globally. Kind of the impact is on global scale, but the countries put effort at the national level. Next slide, please. Article 7 of the convention on the implementation plan, and it states the paragraph 1 of Article 7 says each party shall develop an endeavor to implement a plan for the implementation of its obligation under this convention. So it says it is a mandatory. Each party shall, the verb they have used. So it is mandatory to development of such a plan and to implement such a plan, to implement the obligations under the convention. And the subparagraph B says such plan is to be transmit its implementation plan to the conference of the parties within 2 years. So there is a time frame also. So you have to, each party, those who are party to the convention or become party to the convention, within 2 years, they prepare this plan and transmit it to the COP. Next slide, please. The subparagraph C states that the parties are required to review and update as appropriate its implementation plan on a periodic basis and in the manner to be specified by a decision of the conference of parties. So there are different situations that calls for the review and update of NIP, like the most used or the obvious is when there is a new chemical added to the annexes of the convention that brings the new obligation, and then parties need to review and update their NIP to address that new chemical that is added. And there could be other things also, like in the country, if there are priorities are changed, if situations are changed, political or economic situations are changed, then they might want to review their plan also. So this is and the conference of the parties, I think the first one was on SC27. In the second COP, they adopted a decision on how to review and update. So there's the stepwise process to review and update the NIP, and the situation in what are the triggering factor to review and update of the POPs are listed there. Next slide, please. And paragraph 2 of Article 7, it says it sets the process how this NIP should be prepared and implemented. It says the parties shall, where appropriate, cooperate directly or through global, regional, and sub-regional organizations and consult their national stakeholders, including women's group involved in health and children, in order to facilitate the development, implementation, and updating of their implementation plan. So, it is not only limited only to the Ministry of Environment, who will prepare the national implementation plan and transmit it to the COP. No, it should be more than that. It should include all the stakeholders, national stakeholders, even through the regional organization, sub-regional organization, with there could be NGOs, like it says those groups involved in health of children. And so this is the NIP is to be developed as a national document, including all the sectors and involving the voice of all the people. And such plan is to be discussed thoroughly before it is finalized. So it sets the process of development of NIP. Next slide, please. And paragraph 3 of Article 7 states that the parties shall endeavor to utilize and, where necessary, establish the means to integrate national implementation plan for persistent organic pollutants in their sustainable development strategies where appropriate. So by this paragraph, it says that the NIP should not be developed as a standalone only Stockholm Convention implementing document, but it should be a part of the national implementation, national sustainable development strategy. So that's why it is one of the reason, this plan is to be endorsed by the government as a part of the um, their national sustainable development strategy. So it is not just another plan, might go into the shelf of some Ministry of Environment, but it will become the part of the whole national strategy. So that's how it has been formulated in the convention. Next slide, please. So as I said, this is the NEP development is mandatory. As I said, next. It is to be inclusive, where all the stakeholders, all the sectors are involved. It is a dynamic one. NEP, it does not, once you prepare the NEP and it's done. No, it is to be updated, and in all practical way, what has happened so far is every 2 years there are COP, and every COP has added new chemical, and that calls for the update of the NIP. So in every 2 years, parties are required to update their NIPs. So, if it does not happen in one COP, maybe in another COP, or the subsequent COP will add more chemicals. So it keeps updating. And then it is not, as I said, not stand alone thing, but it integrates into the national policy. And the most important thing is, this is the NEP that is prepared is not only the national document. I mean, it is national document because it is national implementation plan, but parties wanted this to be shared with others, so that other can learn from there, or other can see that what issues are there, so that they also can strategize their situation, and they prepare their NEP. So it is mandatory, inclusive, dynamic, policy integrating, and information sharing. Next slide, please. So, so far what we have seen is there are, we have received the NEP transmitted by the parties up to those addressing up to COP 11, but there are not that many. For the update ones, the latest 10, COP 10 and COP 11, there are just one NIPs received from the parties, but until like COP 8, COP 9, there are quite a good number. For the initial NIP, almost 95-96% of the parties, they have already transmitted their initial NIPs, and the NIPs reviewed updated NIP to address COP 4 amendments. There are like almost 65 to 70% parties have transmitted their NIP. COP 5 also almost the same, and it goes dwindling down, as you go to the further amendments. Next slide, please. So that's the overall mandate and the situation and the status of the NIP NIP transmission and NIP development, and the mandate of NIP. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, you can always write to me. And if you have any clarity question, you can ask me. I'm here. Thank you. Back to you, Amara.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sharma. So I think it's a good reminder to us all of the importance of NIPS and the fact that they are mandatory um, for all of the parties to the Stockholm Convention to do. So now I think we will hold questions for now. We do have a session later on for questions and answers. So if you do have any questions for Mr. Sharma, please do hold them for now, and we will open the floor for questions a bit later on. So now I will pass the floor to Ms. Mahela Pon from the United Nations Environment Program, Ms. Pawn will be presenting on the transition from development of NIPS via POPs categories to the sectoral approach. Ms. Pawn, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Amara, and good morning to everyone, or good afternoon, depending where you are. First of all, on behalf of UNEP, we want to thank BCRC Caribbean for involving us in this webinar and allowing us to present part of the work that we are doing here in UNEP. As you may be aware, UNEP is partnering for a long time on supporting, with the centers, of course, Basel and Stockholm centers, and in supporting countries across the world in developing and updating their NIPS. So it's work area that we have good experience, and we are always producing and bringing forward new knowledge on the topic. So now let's take a deep breath, because this will be the really technical part of today's presentation, I believe. Thank you so much, Amara. So as it was mentioned, the topic of my presentation is how do we move for so-called chemical by chemical type of approach in inventory related work to a more sectoral one. We have seen globally that there is this transition, so to move away addressing chemical by chemical and diving more into the chemical grouping and sectoral approach towards their management. So what I will focus on my presentation today is on this so-called sectoral inventory guidance. This has been prepared in the context of an ongoing project that we have with that is led by UNEP on supporting countries in updating their national implementation plan with financial support from Global Environmental Facility. So what I'm trying to convey in this slide is basically we are not reinventing the wheel. We all know that in the context of the Stockholm Convention, we have guidance inventories for different POPs or POPs groups, as you can see on the right part of my slide, on different, polybrominated substances and PCP, PCN. I will use the acronyms now, PFOS and PFOA. So there are all these POPs and POPs groups that are listed into the convention. So we have all that guidance there, but then how do we use that information in order to conduct our work on different sectors? And for now, the guidance inventory is focusing on 3 key sectors: building and construction, electric and electronics, and transport. But the planning is that later on, as our project advances, to expand it to other key sectors like textiles and plastics and some others that we identify as very relevant. So maybe while looking to the, what are the POPs inventories? Maybe to recap, so there are kind of instruments that we use to collect information on past and present production, use, stockpiles and waste of POPs. And it helps us estimate different POPs presence in different products and articles, for example, and in the waste phase. Why do we do this? I think it's very important to understand. We do this because at end of life of these articles and products present now in our daily lives, we will need to manage this in an environmental manner. So we need to have an understanding on how much is there currently in use or in stock or imported or produced, to be able, through our NIPs and through the action plans that are part of our NIPs, to manage that at the end of life, because we need to have a plan in place at the country level. How do we do that? But also POPs inventories are looking also to somehow identify contaminated sites and where possible to address that issue of sites contaminated with different POPs. Next slide, please. But coming back to the presence of POPs on articles, I think it's important to understand that POPs is just one of the categories of the chemicals, so-called chemicals of concern in these different sectors. And now I'm giving an example of these three sectors. So we need to understand that, for example, these other chemicals of concerns are also addressed by different other conventions, like Basel and Rotterdam, but also Minamata, Montreal Protocol, and recently adopted Global Framework on Chemicals, right, which refers to these issues of concern, which I can mention: lead in paints, endocrine disrupting chemicals, PFAS, and so on. So what this guidance documents that we put forward brings out new, it provides you with this overall understanding what other chemicals are present in different sectors besides POPs, so that you have a deep understanding on the problem, and once you initiate your inventory work, you will be able to address it holistically, right, and avoid fragmentation and avoid going back and forth with the industry representative or other stakeholders in gathering the information. Next slide, please. Yes, so I was just saying that the guidance help us streamline and harmonize the inventories. It also provides the inventory teams a modality to coordinate on data gathering and inventory development across the three sectors, and supports the planning phase, but also gives you a better approach, a more streamlined approach when it comes to approaching different stakeholders. As I said, it's really confusing for different industry categories, you know, like while you are doing your inventory work, as we did it so far, like chemical by chemical, they receive 3 different requests from 3 different inventory teams asking information on a particular POPs or POP category. So it creates an additional admin burden for them, and it's not really effective also for the teams that are dealing with this kind of work. Here on the left side, I just to remind ourselves, I just place what are the 5-step approach in developing the POPs inventories. So from step 1, which is initiating, so we put in place an inventory team, we identify relevant stakeholders, we define the scope of the inventory. And here maybe I want to underline that yes, in the context of the Stockholm Convention, we have all these chemicals listed, we have all this inventory guidance, but I think you need to do like a desk research to understand, are all these chemicals, POPs, present in my country, and you need to have like an initial overview of that and try to prioritize, because in most of the cases they are not all present. Some they are highly prioritized than others, and you will see while I advance on my presentation, we also have some kind of categorization of the different POPs and other chemicals of concern, based on, understanding if it is a former use or if it is a current use, and based on that, you can prioritize. Second step is to choose your data collection methodology, and here we have different methods: indicative, qualitative, quantitative, of course, depending on how much it might be available at the country level. Step 3 is in collecting and compile the data, and here I think most of you who were involved in the NIP update process, you know that there is this tiered approach, right? So starting from initial assessment to main inventory and then in-depth inventory, in the sense conducting analysis and measurements, right? And step 4, basically managing and evaluating the data gathered and preparing the inventory report, which basically forms, is that part of the information that needs to be captured into the section 2 of the NIP, which deals with the baseline inventory data. And then basically for all 3 sectors, you are supposed to follow the same steps. So the steps are there no matter what kind of approach you take. These are the same steps. Next slide, please. So this, I like very much this table because it gives you an overview of the presence of different POPs in the 3 sectors in a simple manner. So to understand, for example, what was the main production and use period, if it is former use, minor use, major use. So this kind of information will help you very much, how should I say, prioritize and strategize within your inventory approach at the country level. So this you can see, I will put the link to the guidance in the chat after my presentation, so you can all at your own pace can dive into it and learn more. Can you go to the next slide? So now I'm starting, so I will just briefly go through each and every sector, starting with building and construction. So just to provide you a bit of the background information. So this sector is one of the most chemical intensive, because we see that there is rapid urbanization, which is growing really fast. And basically, this sector is expected to grow, as well as its chemical market. As the sector grows, the chemicals market grows as well, due to the presence, of different POPs like hexabromocyclododecan, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, short chain chlorinated paraffins, and PFOA, for example, are present in different materials used in construction sector, right? So also the construction and demolition waste is basically one of the largest global waste stream. According to the latest data, I think it's over 30% of the total waste at the global level, which is disposed in landfill. So it's an issue, of course. And yes, we see, countries that are more, are advancing maybe rapidly, and they are focusing on this controlled deconstruction and better pollutant management when it comes to construction and demolition waste management. The issue is that, that in buildings we have many plastic materials, and there is it is challenging to separate the POPs containing plastic from recyclables, right? Recyclable plastic fractions. So that's an issue. And another issue is that these basically, all the buildings have long service lives, how should I say, and these materials are staying there for a long time, for decades, and we are exposed continuously to such chemicals, and basically I think the inventory work is one of the first steps when it comes to on one hand prevent, right, the future use of such materials in new buildings, but also so that is the preventive aspect of the issue, but also so understanding what is there and then try to prevent it, but then also in dealing with managing the construction and demolition waste, right? While once you understand what you may have in your waste, you'll be able to manage it in a proper way that will not lead to further pollution and emissions and so on and so forth. For sure, research and technology are still needed for effective recycling and separation. So that is a thing that is emerging, and new technologies are being developed to be able to deal with that. Next slide, please. So I think most of the things I mentioned, so I think it's critical to inventorize POPs and other chemicals of concern in construction for effective management of construction and demolition waste. And this is a crucial information that should be made available to the government and stakeholders that are responsible for such waste management and for better planning on how they manage this kind of this waste stream. I told you, like, POPs are primarily found in plastic and polymers that are present in buildings, and I think the inventory, if it's done properly, will compile some valuable information on plastic impacted by POPs and other chemicals of concern, and will describe what are the current waste management policies in place and what needs to be done to have better and environmental sound management of it. So next slide, please. So now, no, go one back, I think. Is that one? No, okay, sorry. So for this is a similar table. I like these tables because they are really straightforward and gives you a lot of information in a glance, in few rows. So you will find one similar per each sector in the guidance when you look at. Of course, there is also extensive description of everything that you find in this table. But looking at this one, it provides you with a good understanding, what are the major or minor uses and what is the period of use of different POPs in building and construction sector. Also, it indicates what information is to be collected for the inventory and who are the major stakeholders to possibly have this information, like government and related ministries, national statistical offices, and some others. And also gives reference, where you can find additional information in the, how should I say, individual inventory guidance per different POPs and what is the calculation method. And it also provides you the priority, as you see, based on the former use or the current use. It gives you an indication what is the priority. Is it high? Is it medium? And what kind of tier you can apply when you do your inventory. So I think this is very useful for the national teams and also for other consultants that are supporting national teams with the inventory work. So this you can go in depth, and then you can look more into what type of applications these POPs were used, and and all these details. So I will not detail now because I still have some slides to go through. Second slide is next slide is a continuation of this one, as the POPs list is a long one. So you can go to next one. So you see, so it includes the remaining POPs from the list. Can you go to the next one? So basically the next one, as I was telling you, our guidance is also capturing, right, what are the other chemicals of concern present in this sector in particular. And you will see here example of asbestos, of phthalates, of CFC, you know, that are the ozone depleting substances, lead, of course, mercury, and so on and so forth. And it gives you also an overview of these other substances and which are the MEAs or other agreements or frameworks where these are looked in, right? And it gives you what is the relevance, right? Depending on the use and if it is still ongoing use or former use and things like that. So next slide, please. Okay, so now we are moving to the electronic sectors because I think I have a little time left. So electronic sector, yes, as background information, I think we know that there is of you know, huge quantities of electronic waste that is generated annually. So in 2022 there was 62 million estimated, containing over 12 million of tons of plastics that must be managed sustainably. How should I say? So we still see low recycling rates of e-waste. And this is because of all these harmful additives like polybrominated diphenyleters or hexabromocyclododecane, just to name some, that are present there. And we have also complex plastic mixture in different electronics that, you know, pose challenges in increasing the recycling rates. And we all know that electronics also have a lot of valuable metals. We have seen, you know, a lot of emerging activities on so-called urban mining, so like recovering these valuable metals in e-waste. So this is going a bit faster, but the plastic fraction of it's lagging behind, how should I say, because of the presence of chemicals, and also may lead to, you know, because the recycling may happen and it's not done in, let's say, following the best available techniques of that are there, or is not properly managed. It can lead to contamination of new products. Like we have examples of contaminations of children's toys with chemical substances because these recyclates that they use were not properly assessed and measured, and they were still containing toxic chemicals. And there is the issue of transparency, of course, along the supply chain and value chain. And there is not much information transfer and exchange when it comes to the presence of different additives in plastics. And this basically complicates the whole recycling process, right? These are among the challenges that currently exist. Next slide. So I think from this one, I already I just captured some of the elements, but maybe when conducting this inventory of POPs and other chemicals of concern in electric and electronic sector, you need to look basically at total plastic content in e-waste, for example, content of POPs in new and second-hand products, POPs in electric and electronics being in stock, and also looking on the recycled plastic. As I said, if not done properly, this may lead to further contamination of the new products that are manufactured using that recycled plastic, but also not omitting the e-waste part. So how if there is any import of e-waste, if there is capacity to deal with that, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. So here is the same table that I showed you for the building and construction, but this refers to the electronic sector, so it follows the same structure. It gives you this overview of major and minor uses and the period of use, and key stakeholders, as I said, and reference to the inventory guidance documents on individual POPs and calculation methods and priority as well. So I think this is really useful instrument for you to have this holistic understanding of all the POPs that may be present in the electronic sector, as I mean, compared to the case where you need to read all these inventory guidance documents for individual POPs, and you need to capture all this and to grasp all this information by yourself. So here it's already available. Next slide, please. So this is the second table on the other chemicals of concern that may be present in the sector. So, you know, you see some of them are overlapping with the how should I say, the building and construction sector. So yeah, you see asbestos and you know, ozone depleting substances and polyaromatic polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and so on, heavy metals, of course. So next slide. So now the last sector is the transport sector, the last sector that we are capturing in this guidance document, of course. So here some background information. So we have a large number of vehicles globally, and including 1.1 billion passenger cars, right? Which may contain around 200 million tons of plastic. Can you imagine? So it's huge, huge amount. So for example, each year around these 40 million tons of plastic are generated from passenger vehicles, and you know, this waste needs to be managed in an environmental manner. So it's a lot. It's a huge pressure. On top of other waste streams that, you know, are present in a country context. So it's a huge pressure for the government and all the stakeholders that are in charge of managing this waste. Here, of course, there are valuable metals as well that are largely recovered to recycle. But again, there is the issue with plastic and synthetic textile that, you know, this often ends up in this automotive shredder residues, right? So of course, we need to work more towards promoting the circular economy for better use, recycling, recovery. Of course, vehicles contain hazardous chemicals like POPs, but other chemicals of concern. And I think capturing them in our inventory in the context of POPs is really valuable and can support the end of life waste management, right? Still, there are some gaps in data when it comes to other transport categories like trains and airplanes. So I think that is one of the gaps in data. Next slide, please. So again, you know, the POPs or POPs group are somehow overlapping with other two sectors. We see again PBDEs, short chain chlorinated paraffins or medium chain chlorinated paraffin, PFOA. Again, other chemicals of concern could be PFAS, lead, asbestos. So to some extent, they overlap with other sectors. And yes, what do we need to focus in our inventories is, of course, amount of plastic and polymers in vehicles. So, for example, in the guidance document, it is estimated that around 200 kilos are present per car. This is a car that weighs like 1.35 tons, but we can have larger type of vehicles that may contain more than this, but this is just a number that you can use to do your estimation of plastics and polymers. Next slide, please. So here is a similar table with the presence of different POPs in these sectors and use period and information to be collected. So I think it's very straightforward and can be used. And I especially like the priority column where can help any inventory team prioritize this, because sometimes it's really difficult. How do I prioritize all these, you know, among other priorities that we have in the country context? Next slide. Yes, and this is the one with other chemicals of concern present in the transport sector. We're saying lead, mercury compounds, ozone depleting substances as well, PFAS, they are present there, and they are also subject to, you know, some of them being issues of concern under the Global Framework on Chemicals, which is the predecessor of CARICOM. I think everyone knows about the CARICOM and now about GFC. And I think it's my last slide, if you can. Yes, and the guidance also includes some case studies. So for example, in case of building and construction, the case study for now it's a fictional one, but still gives you a lot of hints on how to approach this sectoral inventories. And then we have other two case studies from Nigeria on the electronic sector and transport sector. So I kindly encourage you to access the web pages and go through it and learn from it. So I think that is all from my side. I thank you very much, and I am here in case there are any questions. I will post the link to the guidance into the chat so everyone can access. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mahila, for your presentation. It was good to hear more about how we can update our NIPs using the sectoral approach to avoid overwhelming stakeholders when we do approach them for data. At this time, one thing I'd just like to remind our participants, if you do have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A channel or the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Just given the time, we're going to ask that any questions be written in the chat, and we'll do our best to respond to them. And we will now move on to our last presentation for this morning. So this one is Setting the Scene, Development and Update of NIPS via the Sectoral Approach in the Caribbean. This will be presented by Ms. Joel Batchesing and Ms. Marissa Charles of the BCRC Caribbean. So I will pass the floor to Jewel to get us started. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much, Amara. I will do the first. You're hearing me well, yes? Yes? Confirming?
Yes.
Great, yes. Thanks again, and it's Mahela's presentation was really very technical, and this presentation seeks to really explain. So I'll do the first part and Marissa will talk about the agricultural sector, because Mahela's presentation looked at the construction, the end-of-life vehicles, transport sector, etc. So just to set the context on what has been done with POPs inventories in the Caribbean region is that, as many of you would know, if you don't know, the center was facilitating a project, a legacy project called 5558. And under that project, we actually updated 8 national implementation plans. And subsequent to that, we are finalizing the national implementation plan for the government of Guyana and working now on the updates for Dominica and the Bahamas currently. So one of the things was that through that legacy project, we did develop a regional manual, and subsequent to the 2023 Conference of Parties, it was further updated to reflect some of the new information. And that resource is available, and it identifies the main objective of conducting these POPs inventories. So everything from, as you can see, information on the production and import of POPs to looking at gaps and then looking at strategies and overall POPs management and destruction. So this resource is available to you, and it is, we believe it is a very good resource to keep current with what is happening on the constantly evolving process that's happening at the Conference of Parties as well. And as you could hear from Mahela's presentation, this really synergizes here. So if you go to the next slide, it's just a snapshot to show that we do have the general guidance, which was revised, the inventory guidances, which was revised, and the action plan development, there was a revision as well. So overall, they have been developed to support the parties in developing and updating their NIPs via the Stockholm Convention Secretariat. The next slide on the approach to developing the POPs inventories, and some of you, I look at the participants, and many of you would know these steps, but just for the purposes of the inventory, you definitely have to look at what is your scope and the target for the sectors and the important sectors for the region, but also for the country, but also for what is where data is available. The second task is, of course, to have the buy-in of a stakeholder engagement is very important for this process to be successful. This has always been our experience, that making sure that the inventory process is comprehensive. You need to have all of the stakeholders and a good stakeholder inventory, because it may, oftentimes when you look at the inventory list, it's stakeholders that you don't usually engage with. For instance, firefighters always comes to mind for PFOS before. So the other one is also to develop a clear work plan for the inventory and make sure that there's constant discussion with the stakeholders. We've seen different approaches work where using smaller stakeholder grouping has worked in some countries versus the larger meetings where persons may get lost. So these are some of the recommendations going forward. The next slide looks at the approaches to developing the inventories, and I'm not sure if you could see the tiers there. But looking at the initial assessment, looking at the inventory, and then actually looking at the sampling. And just to say here that our experience, with maybe the exception of a few countries who were able to, we generally don't get to the point of actually doing sampling because of costs, but it is, the highest form of getting a good inventory. And you would have seen that in Mahela's slides, where the tier 2 and tier 3, especially for these newer areas, is absolutely critical. So choosing that correct data collection methodology is very important in developing these POPs inventories and making sure that you have good data going forward. As I look to wrap up my section here, we see the step 3, collecting and compiling from the key stakeholders. So it is important to look at what we call the sectoral approach, and on the guidance document prepared through the Green Growth Knowledge Platform and Dr. Weber under the Global NIPS project is one to consider for industrial POPs in the sectors of construction, electronics, and vehicles, which was presented by Michaela, and that the principles of the approach can be applied for other sectors such as agriculture that Marissa will explain. So the sectoral approach is well known to many of you, but just again, on the next slide, you will see that some of these areas that you would know is that we tend to break the inventory into these sectors of agriculture, industrial to cover the P4, PCNs, PCBs, HBCDs, and of course the UPOPs category, which is the unintentionally produced persistent organic pollutants. The last slide that I have to cover, which is the next slide, is the approach to developing the POPs inventories again and managing and evaluating the data. And for the purposes of this, you would see that assessing the information is important. And the part that we've seen that has been troublesome oftentimes is getting the country priorities and getting the action plan developed. And it's very important that it goes without saying that assigning the responsibility to certain actors is very important, because then what we've seen is that the action plan sits on a shelf, and we do or advise the setting up of the short, medium, and long-term objectives. But it's equally important to make sure that the right persons are the ones responsible for the overall rollout of that action plan, because then the countries would be just literally having a document that stays on a shelf. And it's really not a single entity that's responsible for persistent organic pollutants. It has to be a team effort at a country level as well. So I'll stop there and I'll pass to Marissa very seamlessly. Marissa, over to you.
Thank you, Joel. Good morning, everyone. So, as a follow-up to Mahila's presentation on the industrial side of things, so we'll focus on the agricultural sector, looking at the POPs that are listed as pesticides under the Stockholm Convention. So further to the COP that was hosted in 2023, we are now at 19 chemicals that are listed under the Stockholm Convention as pesticides if you include sulfuramide, which is a precursor to PFOS as an industrial chemical. So these chemicals, quite a few of them have been identified either in the past use within the Caribbean. However, most of them, as you would see later on, are banned in the Caribbean or restricted for use and imports. For the inventory process, inventories for the Caribbean region as well as internationally should really focus and provide information on the legislative, regulatory, and enforcement systems that are available in terms of managing POPs pesticides, including those newly listed POPs, which include dicofol and methoxychlor, as well as now considering in terms of other chemicals of concern, and in this case, the highly hazardous pesticides. The POPs inventory for pesticides should include clarification on whether any obsolete pesticides that were identified in the countries have been exported, as well as if any new obsolete pesticides can be built up in terms of stockpiles in the near future. The inventory should report on historical current production, any import, export, use, stockpiles, and waste should be considered, especially considering the FAO activities that are implemented throughout the Caribbean region. Potentially contaminated sites is another topic that should be covered under your POPs pesticide inventory, to include the highly hazardous pesticides, given that in the past there may have been sites that were using pesticides. Okay. And we should also detail data gaps and deficiencies in the knowledge of POPs pesticides, as well as any gaps in terms of monitoring for POPs pesticides. The inventory report should provide clear recommendations and action plans to address the context of the NIP. All right, so in terms of stockpiles, it should also indicate relevant changes. So in the initial step, you would review the initial POPs pesticide inventory, considering whether or not what was reported has already been in the time period from the initial report been destroyed, whether or not there are new stockpiles, the status of the implementation of the action plan. So in the case of countries that indicated that chemicals were still listed for use or available for use and could be imported, the new or updated inventory should record whether or not there were changes to regulations to provide for or banning or restricting import, production, export. In the Caribbean region, we don't necessarily produce pesticides, but rather the import is the main source of pesticides. Any legislative or infrastructural changes, institutional changes should also be recorded. It's noted that in some countries, DDT is still listed with an exemption for vector control against malaria. And so should this change in your updated pesticide report, this should also be indicated, as well as the listing of the alternatives that are used and consideration for any impediments. In terms of the newly listed pesticides, things to consider in doing the inventory. Was the pesticide already banned in your country before it was considered at the COP? Has it ever been imported? What were the uses of this particular chemical? And how many quantities were recently imported in the recent past? What quantities are in stockpiles? Are there any potentially contaminated sites based on their use, storage locations, or disposal locations? And are there any suitable alternatives for them on the market based on the guidance documents provided through the Secretariat and UNEP? For the Caribbean region, POPs pesticides have been largely phased out with the exceptions of DDT and in some cases PCP, which is pentachlorophenol, which has been used for wood treatment on utility poles. In the inventory reports conducted under the draft 5558 project. This has been recognized for Belize in terms of the DDT as well as for the PCP in wood treatment in countries such as Suriname and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, according to the inventory reports. You'd recognize on the photo on the right-hand side, most countries through their pesticides control boards have been very proactive in terms of banning, deregistering, or prohibiting the import and use of the original dirty dozen of pesticides. But also the newly listed pesticides. A lot of your PCBs or pesticide chemicals control boards are pretty active in following the Rotterdam and Stockholm conventions and have been effective in terms of meeting the obligations. In terms of considering obsolete pesticides, a recent project in the Caribbean region executed by the FAO has removed obsolete pesticides from up to 11 Caribbean countries. It has been noted, however, through that project that the highly hazardous pesticides that are relevant within the Caribbean region needs to be more documented. So it's indicated that the alternatives to these chemical pesticides are not readily available to farmers. And out of the 299 highly hazardous pesticide products, out of more than 2,873 registered pesticides in the Caribbean, they have been identified. There's no official place also to consider for disposal of empty pesticide containers. However, we know this is a consideration that many of you Caribbean countries have been taken into consideration lately, and I will speak to one of them a little later in slides. So for the overall POPs inventory, the FAO did recommend the continued monitoring of these highly hazardous pesticides to include in the assessment for the POPs inventory reports. In terms of some of the key stakeholders that have been consulted through the regional as well as national projects conducted through the BCRC Caribbean. So important key stakeholders would be Ministry of Agriculture, of course, your Pesticide Control Board or Registration Authority, pesticide producers or more so distributors in this case for our Caribbean region, commercial farm owners and operators, your agriculture extension offices, in the case of larger countries, a Ministry of Interior or similarly Ministry of Planning. In the case of pentachlorophenol utility companies, as well as consideration for Ministry of Health, which will include veterinary services that may use some of the chemicals, your research institutions and farmers associations. And in terms of contaminated sites, some of the key areas I would have mentioned before where you store either the pesticide while being used or storing it as waste. And many times, in many cases, they may have been stored in the past in uncontrolled conditions. And so this should be considered when thinking about possible contaminated sites, landfills or open dump sites where your empty pesticide containers may end up, or even in some case, obsolete pesticides within the containers, as well as the sites where the pesticides were applied to for crop and livestock production. So some limitations that may exist in the Caribbean region include the lack of records or documentation. This could be whether it is on the import side, whether it speaks to the illegal import or the use and entry of counterfeit POPs pesticides also needs to be considered. There has been recognized through the POPs inventory reports that many cases there's a limited analytical capacity for monitoring, as well as in terms of looking at contaminated sites, there's limited studies or assessments being done on the soil in terms of past agricultural lands, as well as limited remediation activities further to the use of these pesticides over a period of time. In terms of considering a more overall approach and not just considering pesticides within the agricultural sector, it's important to note that this sector can also be a source of looking for POPs that are more industrial or unintentionally produced. In terms of the sugar industry, it has been recognized through our POPs inventories that a lot of the entities where you had sugar factories in the past also did use PCB containing transformers, which has been the case for Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and Guyana. And in terms of rice production, it has been reported that pentachlorophenol has been used in the past for rice fields in Suriname. And so therefore, this has contributed to the overall dioxin released in the environment. So between 1964 and the 1970s, it was approximately estimated that 5,565 grams per TQ has been reported for Suriname in terms of pentachlorophenol as in UPOPs dioxin releases. Another consideration would be in terms of the empty pesticide containers, the consideration of plastics and packaging that is coming out of the agricultural sector. So to support the pesticide inventory, the FTO has developed guidance documents that can be used in terms of looking at the toolkits for obsolete pesticides, as well as the inventory of pesticides and contaminated materials. And based on the previous project, here's a snapshot of the quantities of pesticides, empty containers that have been reported for the Caribbean region. You can see that you have from smaller countries, as little as 8,915 kilograms and as large as 24 tons of waste that is or reported. Under the 54/7 project, most of these Caribbean countries were able to facilitate the removal of pesticides as well as look at some of their management of the empty pesticide containers. For Belize, it was recognized through their update of their NIP in the recent project that there was really a need for comprehensive management of empty pesticide containers. And so a national roadmap or plan was developed to look at the comprehensive management of these pesticide containers. For the context of Belize, pesticides, all the pesticides are imported, and it was recognized that over 309,000 kilos of pesticide containers is generated on an annual basis. And so the current practices included just reusing it or leaving it within the field, burning it or dumping it in municipal garbage. And so the new recommended collection system here includes many collection centers, consideration for transportation to the collection centers, and then compacting it for shipment for final disposal or recycling. The action plan speaks to also training or capacity building for the entities that have now formed a part of this a pesticides an association amongst the farmers and those in the agriculture sector. It speaks to the need for policy or legislation reform as well as public awareness for improved management of empty pesticide containers. It should be noted that the BCRC Caribbean is also currently working with um, Antigua and Barbuda as well as Guyana in order to test the current guidelines that are developed through the BRS Secretariat at this time to further the work that we did start here with Belize in terms of looking at an inventory for empty pesticide containers. Okay, so with that, so we listed a few key resources that include the guidance documents that have been mentioned before that are provided on the BRS Secretariat website, including for the new inclusion of dicofol. There are inventory guidance, the inventory guidance document for that. The regional manual that has been prepared by Dr. Roland Weber, as Joel mentioned, is available, so you can contact the BCRC Caribbean for a copy, and we hope to have it also soon on our websites. And the consideration for the sectoral approach, I believe Mahela did drop the link for this as well on the chat. And we would like to also make mention to the online course that has been developed in terms of Stockholm Convention and Caribbean POPs management, which should be launching this week on Friday, which will have other resources in terms of the management of POPs and information within the Caribbean region. So with that, I thank you very much, everyone, for your time. I'll pass to Amara.
Thank you very much, Jewel and Marissa, for that presentation, giving us more context to the Caribbean region. Okay, so now we would like to invite participants to ask any questions that they might have. I'd like to thank the participants who did drop a few questions in the Q&A previously. And thanks very much to Mahela for supporting us with answering them. Again, if anyone would like to take a look at what was answered, please feel free to click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Yes, so does anyone have any additional questions that they'd like to ask at this time? see that Tashia has her hand raised. Tashia, you can
Yes.
take the floor.
Thanks, Amara. So just a quick question. I'm just looking at all the information that has been shared today. Quite useful, but I'm considering the possibility of dissemination to your youth because they are usually a good tool to use to share information to their age group and older or younger. So has any information been translated into smaller products that can be shared with different age groups on these topics? Thanks.
Hi, I can probably take the question. Thank you, Tashia. So in terms of information about POPs in general, we do have the Stop the POPs website that does have, it is a source of resources for students that are in both primary, secondary school level, but also on the secondary level. It may not be in very much detail for this primary and secondary level in terms of what is required for the inventory process. However, the MOOC or the online course that will be shared or launched this week, it does provide an opportunity for university students, those now getting in the field in terms of waste management or POPs management, to understand the inventory process as well as more about managing POPs. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Marissa. I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A. So just asking one more time if there are any other questions. Yes. Okay, so Diana has asked if we'll be sharing a link to the MOOC on the BCRC social media, and I can say yes, we are. We've also been sharing some teasers leading up to the launch. So yes, you can definitely look out for a link to the MOOC on our social media. All right. Well, given the time, okay, so just before we wrap up, I would like to just pass the floor back to Marissa to take us through the next steps. Thank you,
Yes.
Marissa.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, everyone. So I would like to say thanks to all our panelists for assisting with opening remarks as well as presentations today. I think it was useful, and thank you very much to the attendees for your useful questions. Given that this webinar has been part of an overall project that we are executing on behalf of the CARICOM, we just wanted to list in terms of some of the ongoing activities and upcoming next steps. So currently, the review for risk assessment in terms of a guidelines document is being conducted through our consultants, as well as a regional assessment for methodologies used in risk assessment. For Grenada and Jamaica, there's currently a legislative assessment that's ongoing as well and will be shared with the key stakeholders there with respect to the management of chemicals and waste under the Stockholm Convention. Further to that, a training workshop there will be three types of workshops that will happen and be hosted in Trinidad and Tobago. So the first being on February 19th for the update of national legal regulatory frameworks on preparation for the national implementation plans. Based on our contract with CARICOM, this will be for Grenada, Jamaica, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And for the notification process for the final regulatory action, this will happen on March 17th in Trinidad and Tobago, followed by the workshop on the environmental sound management of POPs on March 21st. And so those stakeholders who are key to participate in these events have been notified via email. You should have received invitations, and in terms of the outputs are being updated as well via email. Thank you. I will pass to Jewel if there's anything additional here.
Thanks, Marissa, and just to say thanks to everyone for participating and really looking forward. I was again, thanks to the CARICOM Secretariat, the BRS Secretariat, and UNEP for their support. And I'm also happy to see that I see Grenada is in the attendees list as the newest party to the Stockholm Convention for the Caribbean region. We would be happy to support you as well with some of this information. As you can see, it's quite a lot. So thanks again, and thanks to the BCRC Caribbean team again for their steadfast support. Are we taking a picture, by the way? Sorry.
Yes.
Thank
All
you.
right. So yes, I just, oh, right. Yes. Before we do leave, we just kindly like to ask all of our attendees to please scan the QR form that's on your screen right now, and it'll take you to an evaluation form that we kindly ask that you take a few minutes to complete to let us know your thoughts on today's session. And with that, I would like to say thanks very much for your time and joining us today, and we hope you found it beneficial. And of course, we will share the resources that was presented as well as flagged for you. Okay. And yes, we just ask that the panelists stay on for a few more minutes. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon, good rest of your morning, and good day.
Thank you, everyone.